Hello, everybody, and welcome to another GAMERA podcast episode. It's been a long while, but now I'm finally back to doing podcasting. It's been 2 months since I did my last one for my anniversary channel to talk about the original 1954 Godzilla film. Yeah, yeah, the reason I haven't been doing any podcasts in a few months is because I've been focusing for my panel at GFest this year that I already did about the Return of Godzilla 40th anniversary, and and so in this episode we will be talking about one of the best Shona Gamera films. It is Gamera versus GYAOS, also known in the US title The Return of the Giant Monsters. And we have a special guest here for tonight. He is the host of the Kaiju Conversation. Please welcome Elijah Thomas.
Hello.
How's it going, buddy?
It's going great. Going great.
And it's good to have you back on my channel. And you've been a few of my episodes with Nathan and Daniel, right?
Yes, I was on your GMK episode. I believe
Yeah.
I was
Yeah, that's right.
-1 as well. One of the two. You did two, didn't you?
Yeah, I think I did have you on GMK episode and -1, and looks like we have someone in the chat. It is Madison. It's my old schoolmate. Hey, how's it going?
Hello.
Yeah, I went to school with her.
Nice.
So we will be talking about one of the best Gamera films versus GAOS from 1967. I think.
Yes.
Yeah, 67.
March 15th of 1967. You want to know something that's really interesting, Brendan?
What?
So it's funny we're doing this live stream today because my podcast, Kaiju Conversation, also for our 99th episode, we published ours on Gamera versus GYAOS.
Wow.
Yeah, so double dipping.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to more details of that. I mean, first, I want to talk about one of my favorite chats for my show is how do we discover this film for the first time back then? Like who? Like, do you want to go first or me?
Whichever one you'd like.
I think you would go first as you're the guest. And so tell us how you discovered this film for the first time back then. Try to remember.
Oh boy. So it's funny. I feel like most of the Gamera films I watched as a young kid, but it was like I watched them from the library. Like I borrowed them from the library and then I watched them and I completely forgot about them. And then I wouldn't rediscover them until much later whenever I did when I bought this little box set. It wasn't a Mill Creek one. It was a box set that had all of the original Showa Gamera films sans Gamera the Super Monster. And then it had Monster from Prehistoric Planet, or as you might know it as Gappa, the Triphibian Monster.
Oh yeah. That was on the double feature DVD for Destroy All Planets. But that's another DVD company said, and for Versus Monster X.
Yeah, no. What's interesting about the Gamera franchise and Gappa specifically is they all were licensed from Daiei and Nikatsu to AITV, American International Television, a subsidiary of American International Pictures, the same company that would do Godzilla Destroy All Monsters, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, and I want to say that was it. I think, if I remember correctly.
Oh yeah, the American International Pictures or Television. They have all the rights for these Gamera films for the U.S. and Yeah, well, thanks for sharing your memories of that, Elijah. I would like to talk about how I first discovered this film. I already explained it in one of my previous episodes that my uncle introduced me to Gamera, and he has all the Gamera films on DVD, the older ones, and I remember when I watched Destroy All Planets. I remember when they show a flashback scene of it shows like Gamera, was finding a giant, bird like creature. I don't know what that monster is, but when I was looking through well, first many years later, I learned that that bird here, his name is GYAOS, and I was, well, first, Elijah, do you remember the old Netflix that was back then that you got from the mail before it was streamed?
I know of it. My family was poor, so we didn't use Netflix at all.
Oh, and yeah, I remember the old Netflix back then where you used to go online to go Netflix.com and then rent a movie. You get it from the mail, and yeah, we used to do that back then. And I type in Gamma to see if there are any more Gamma films I have never seen. The one thing I saw is called titled "Return of the Giant Monsters," which is the U.S. title, and when I rented it, I was hoping if that was going to be like the GAOS film, and it is. It's and I remember when after I got from the mail, I went downstairs and watched it, and I was like, wow. This monster is awesome looking. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Oh, go ahead.
that's so far I remember that I saw that film. And then
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go
and
ahead.
and then a few years later and then I realized that my uncle has that film on DVD of the double feature DVD that has the Magic Serpa. eh,
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. And yeah, yeah, Michael, my uncle has that film all this time, and then I usually watch it with my cousins in their family room. Yeah, so my cousins that are like Gamera fans. Yeah, and they're the ones who introduced me to Gamera.
Nice. See, I remember my introduction to GYAOS, specifically the character of GYAOS, was somehow it's almost like the kaiju genre was destined to be something I got into because in at my house, in my parents' living room, they had a ton of DVDs. And I stumbled upon one of these DVDs, and it was called Attack of the Monsters.
Oh yeah, that's Gamera versus Guron.
Yes, which has a brief moment. Now, this is the AITV version. So, first of all, you're talking 4.3 aspect ratio. It's a poor print. It sounds awful. It looks awful.
Yeah, I
But
remember.
they were like, "Oh, look, it's Gauss, but it's a different color. It's another galaxy's Gauss." I think is what they say. And that was my introduction to Gauss was through the silver variant in Attack of the Monsters. And then I think after that, I'm almost certain that it was followed by like watching stock footage from Attack of Legion because I think they do showcase the Gyaos in that film as well. And then I think I finally was able to watch the original Gamer versus Gyaos. Uh, like I said on those, it was probably either the Shout Factory DVDs or it was another like box set of AITV kaiju movies featuring Gamera and Gappa.
Hmm. Yeah, and yeah, the gals are in Attack of the Monsters as Giron. That is the same Gau's suit, but they repainted him and because of money budget.
Yes, yes. The budgets for these films after Gyaos were greatly decreased, which I actually found out why they were, which I go into great detail in my episode on GAOS that came out today. But it's really funny how Gamera versus GYAOS is the last hurrah of the Dai larger budgeted kaiju films. It's the last A picture that Dai produced for Gamera. Following this, they would be back to B pictures like Gamera the Giant Monster was.
Yeah, and I gotta say, Giles is kind of it's like a popular Gamera kaiju character. It's he's like popular. It's kind of like Godzilla's famous enemy King Ghidorah, or and and I know some fans say that Giles Giles is kind of like a ripoff of Rodan, a little bit.
Yeah, I've seen that comparison, but I think it's also important to note that they are pretty different. The only thing that's similar is the build, which makes sense because they were suits, and the fact that they're both flying monsters. But Gyaos is 100% the most popular Gamera kaiju outside of Gamera himself, because he's appeared in after Gyaos, he reappeared in Attack of the Monsters. He was in stock footage in Viras, I think, but every Gamera film utilized like 20 minutes of stock footage to pad out its runtime. So if you want to be technical, Gyao showed up in like everything in the Showa era outside of Barugon and the Giant Monster. And then Gyaos was one of the main overarching villains of Shusuke Kaneko's Gamera trilogy whenever you had Hyper Gyaos and whatnot in Guardian of the Universe, stock footage of Gyaos in Legion, and swarms of Gyaos appearing in Iris. And then you even see them again in Gamera the Brave in the opening.
Yes.
And if you remember in Gamera Rebirth, the recent Netflix anime trilogy, or not trilogy, anime series, there was an episode devoted to Gauss, and then they brought him back as the main supervillain of the final episode. So
Wow.
yeah,
And
they love Gauss.
yeah, and to be honest, Elijah, I have never seen the anime series of Gamera on Netflix.
Really?
I've never seen it.
Is
I've,
there a reason? Not interested? Just don't
I
have
mean,
time?
I mean, to be honest, I'm not too crazy about the anime series on Netflix yeah, Netflix always had these bad anime series and kind of like the Godzilla anime trilogy that which I hate so much. And I mean, the singular points, it was like between. I mean, oh, all right. I mean, it's just the anime on Netflix. It's just they're not as good. I mean, but if but hopefully I've never watched the Gamera anime series, but hopefully I'll give that series a try.
Yeah, I will say this. So on Netflix you have a couple shows. You have Pacific Rim the Black, you have Ultraman Rising, the anime trilogy of Godzilla films, Singular Point, Rebirth, and then you have Skull Island, a monsterverse esque anime series that I think Legendary forgets they produced. um and I don't believe Netflix outside of Skull Island and possibly Pacific Rim in the anime trilogy and Rising. So about half of it. The rest of it, so that's Rebirth, that's Ultraman, the other anime, like just Ultraman, Singular Point. All of those were produced by other companies. Netflix is just acting as the distributor for it. So they're a little different than like the anime trilogy and whatnot because they weren't Netflix governed, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's some good anime shows on Netflix. I mean, so let's get back to the film. I mean, so I want to talk about Gals a little bit. I mean, I know the suit looks amazing in the film, and the wings are very long, and I noticed when on the back of the suit, I don't know if his back you see all of this. I mean, it almost looks like you almost like a little. suit door zipper, like that you entering into the suit.
It probably was because the suit was not very flexible. It actually had a, I believe, so my co-host Rex, he said it in our episode, I think best. It's a Batman 1989 circumstance where the head could not move. Like if you remember in Michael Keaton's Batman movie, he never moves his head. He has to move his whole body to look around because he could not move the head. And that's the same for the GYAOS suit. He like they would have to move like this for GYAOS to look around.
Oh yeah, it's just yeah, and we also learned in the film that when they took an X-ray of, they show pictures of X-rays of GAOS, and he has like a second spine, uh, is like that's has to the neck, and
Right.
yeah, so he has two spinal cords like on the back of his head, on the back of him and his neck. That's why his head could not turn around.
It's
And
it's a really cool in-universe explanation for what was simply a technical issue with how they built the suit. I do appreciate that creativity.
what makes Giles so cool is because he can actually shoot lasers.
Yes, a supersonic beam, I believe. It's the same kind of thing that like Titanosaurus in Terror of Mechagodzilla's like weaknesses is supersonic beams. It's the same thing, but as an actual beam. There he is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the beam can actually slice things in half like a knife cutting bread.
You know, it's interesting. After Barugon, you had Gyaos, which had a beam that would cut things. Viras had like the knife on the end of his head that he used to pierce Gamera. Guiron was a literal knife. Jiger like had things that he would like stab Gamera with, and Gamera ended up stabbing Jiger with something. The Gamera franchise likes stabbing and cutting things. If you haven't noticed, I mean, Iris also has those tentacles with like knives at the end of them too, and so does Legion.
Yeah, and this is like the first Gamma film that Gamma actually bleeds.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, his blood is like a bluish greenish color to it. I mean, that's one of my favorite moments in the film. They at the god almost sliced Gamma's arm in half, and is it's. But first, let me back it up to the. So I know that in the previous Gamma film that we show that Baragon bleeds after Gamma just, yeah, almost like punching in the face, and then he just kind of bleeds. I don't know. It looks like he pinched him a little bit, but I mean, well, first of all, I mean, when when the creator of Gamma or the or the director of Gamma is like, it's like the first film. I mean, I know there was a kid in the original film, and and that film was almost made for kids, but in the second film, I mean, it doesn't have kids, and it's not like a kid friendly sort of film, but I mean, Gamera in the original, he's more of a villain, and in it a little bit. I mean, I know he's kind of confused a bit. Hey, he's just destroy humanity in Tokyo. I mean, and the second film, Gamma versus Barugon, I mean, I don't know if he's more of a good guy in this one. I mean, I don't know if it's like between good and bad. I mean, I don't know. He's fighting Barugon for humanity, but but who's who did the Gamera series? Who is the director of it?
That would be Noriaki Iwasa. He was the one that directed all of them besides Barugon. For that one, he was demoted to effects director. And
Yeah,
that was the whole back and forth on specifically Gamera the Giant Monster, Barugon, and Gyaos mostly came from Hidemasa Nagata, the son of the president of Dai, Masashi Nagata at the time. He wanted to take the franchise to a more serious tone for Barugon, and then it did not do well whatsoever.
yeah. I mean, I mean, Barugan is one of my favorite Gamera films, and I know that it's not the best one. I mean, so Nichiro Ogata did look back to one of his previous films, and did he think that the first one was more interesting for kids because of that kid in the original. He was saved by Gamera. He thought that Gamera was more into kid-friendly century. So he decided, why not make Gamera the friend of all children? And that's what make and Gamera versus GYAOS was the first, almost the first Gamera film that ever made Gamera into a hero and a friend of all children.
Right. Yeah, it's a combination of Nissan Takahashi, his writing, and Noriaki Uwasa's direction that really this film specifically is the beginning of the formulaic Gamera films that we saw following this up until Gamera versus Jiger, and then they kind of changed it up for Super Monster a bit. But yeah, this is the beginning of that friend of all children cliche of the franchise, and also Gamera is very much a pro-government character in this film, which is really funny. And I can never look at this film the same again after learning that factoid.
Yeah, and I just watched the film like 2 days ago. I mean, in English dub, the AIP dub version. And, and that dub is always had. That's the one I always watched growing up. I mean, and I also watched the Sandy Frank dub version that I always watched, but with Mystery Science Theater 3000. It,
Yeah, when I rewatched this recently, I oddly enough I watched it with the Japanese language with subtitles. I didn't watch the dub like I normally would.
yeah, well, I did watch the original Japanese language like back then when they released the earliest Blu-ray films in America like 10 years ago before Arrow Video bought the rights to the films to and yeah, yeah, and I'm glad that Arrow Video did release all of them in one complete Blu-ray collection, and they have both dubs in it, and then I'm glad I got to watch them in dubs. Like whatever time I do a Gamera movie marathon, like I usually watch them in order in English dub, but right after the first dub, I watch the second dub the a day later.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I I honestly I don't know if I've watched the Sandy Frank version. I don't know if I have. I think I've
Well,
only watched the AITV in the Japanese version.
well, some say that the Sandy Frank dub version is kind of like the international dub, uh, if that's what they call it. Because and but yeah, but I prefer to the AIP dubs version because I think they had the best lines in it than the international dub. And believe me, Gamma versus J, J, Ger, uh, Giron is
Guiron?
Giron.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but the Sandy Frank dub for Gamma versus Giron, it sounds terrible.
Does it?
Yeah, believe me. I mean, the the voices in there, they just sound ridiculous, and it's just the voice dubbing is sound terrible.
Yeah, honestly, the when I think back, I think the only Sandy Frank dub I've watched is Gamera the Giant Monster. I cuz I So I own Gamera versus Mystery Science Theater 3000, that DVD box set, but I have never watched any of the MST3K things. I cannot stand watching any of it. Like MST3K is not for me. I'm not somebody that likes watching a film get riffed on.
Uh,
I'm more interested in, if somebody's going to talk over it, I want to hear the facts. I want to hear the production history, stuff like that. So for me, the MST3K stuff is an area of Gamera that I don't even remember whatsoever or know.
hmm.
So
Yeah, and sorry of that if you heard my dog barking.
good.
Yeah,
Maybe
it,
Gamera's flying by.
yeah, or GAOS, or maybe he's getting. Oh, he's right outside my door. I'm so sorry. Maybe Giles was trying to eat him, kind of like in
Maybe.
Guardian of the Universe.
Maybe. That very well could be a possibility.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this has happened before. He barked during my one of my episodes 2 years ago. I mean, this is like the
He wants to
first.
be in the stream. Maybe that I would totally do that. I would bark if I had to be on a live stream.
Yeah, but well, anyway, where was I? Uh,
We were talking about Mystery Science
oh
Theaters.
yeah, I mean, I know I know you say you're not too crazy about the Mystery Science Theaters and but I know my stepdad is a huge fan of that series. He loves watching them. And I did watch all of the Gamera Mystery Science Theater films. And yeah, and his so anyway, like I don't didn't when they released it in the US, uh, did they release it in the year after it came out in
Yeah, so
Japan?
it went on syndication on television in 1968. We don't know an exact date, but it came out here in the States in 1968, aired on television. I know a lot of people probably watched it right after school, where they would have like monster movie marathons or during like Saturday mornings. Especially in the 70s and 80s. A lot of people saw giant monster movies during those time periods. Um, in Japan, it was released on a double feature with a Japanese Soviet co production film called The Little Fugitive. And
Oh.
yeah, Daiei did a lot of double features. Actually, Gamera versus Barugon, I don't know if you knew this, was released with Daimajin.
Oh, Daimajin. Yeah. I actually had the newest Bandai figure of that guy at GFest a few weeks ago. I gotta say that figure looks cool.
I bought it last G Fest because I love Daimajin. He is such a cool character.
Let me be honest, Elijah. I've never seen the Dimension trilogy.
Oh, you should. They're very good.
If I buy it on Amazon, I would definitely watch them and maybe do a podcast episode about the trilogy.
I think you absolutely should. They're very interesting. So another interesting fact about Gamera and Daiei. So Daiei was split up into two different companies, studios more likely, more they would be called studios. You had Daiei Tokyo and you had Daiei Kyoto. Tokyo was the studio behind your Gamera films, behind, I believe, Warning from Space. A lot of your Daiei films came from Daiei Tokyo, but they were not. They were more modern. They were a little cheaper, a little less likely to be an A film. They would be the B film typically. And then you had Daiei Kyoto. Now that's the company behind films like Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, I believe Ugetsu, Gate of Hell, these classic Japanese films. The Zatoichi franchise was born from Daiei Kyoto. So they focused a lot on your Edo period Jedi samurai films. They worked on producing high quality stuff. There was a huge competition between the two companies who could produce the best work. Daiei Kyoto famously beat Daiei Tokyo all the time. So Daimajin that trilogy was produced in Daiei Kyoto at the same time that Daiei Tokyo was doing Gamera versus Barugon and Gamera versus GYAOS. So that's how they were able to produce two tokusatsu kaiju franchises at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's very obvious that Daimajin and that trilogy of films and the yokai monster trilogy that Daiei did in the late 60s also was at Daiei Kyoto. It's very obvious that they were done at a completely different studio if you look at the quality of film.
Wow, that's very interesting. I got to do more research about this. Like, yeah, doing research about these gamma films are so difficult, and it's hard to find some research and
Yeah, I've had the privilege to be able to cover Gamera the Giant Monster, Gamera versus Barugon, Gamera versus Gyaos, and Daimajin on my podcast. We actually, this month was Daiei Kaiju month for Kaiju Conversations. So we did Barugon, Gyaos, Daimajin, and the Whale God. And so I've had to do a huge deep dive into Daiei, Masashi Nagata, and these films because you're right. Like it's actually really difficult to find good information on these films, and so I've kind of went to the ends of the earth to really get some information here.
yeah, and so back to the film. So let's talk about the main hero himself, Gamera. And I mean, he is back in this. This thing, he is the friend of all children in this for the first time in the Shona era, and the suit in this, like, I don't know, it's the suit or the head looks so different than in the previous films.
Yes, this was a new suit. They produced a new suit for this one. They did reuse the original Gamera suit for the underwater sequences, but that was about it. Everything else was a new suit for Gamera.
Why? Because like I say, they actually update the head. I mean, it wasn't the same head it was from the Gamma versus Barugon. I mean, the reason I mentioned the head because it looks slightly different than the previous film. I mean, I know that because if it's the fangs, I mean, to me, I think it was the fangs. I mean, or it's his mouth. I mean, yeah. I mean, I gotta say that the fangs in this film are just like are straight up, but it's like almost side. I mean, but in the two previous films, it's like his side fangs are like almost jutted out, almost a few away from his face. Like,
It's little less scary, I think, this time around than in previous iterations, which makes sense when you look at the context of the film. You know, another thing about Daikaiju Gamera, Gamera the Giant Monster, is that the film is shot almost like a horror movie at points. And Noriaki Yuasa would go on to do a horror film in 1968, The Snake Girl and the Silver-Haired Witch, which is a gothic horror film set in a mansion, and it's a Scooby-Doo kind of esque story. And so Noriaki Yuasa did have some horror interest in doing some horror stuff, and Daiei has done tons of stuff. They did a whole series of ghost story movies. They did a whole series of ghost cat stories. So that first film is very much more in line with a horror film to a certain extent, while also kind of hinting at Gamera being the friend to children that Noriaki Yuasa also wanted to do. And then for Barugon, obviously they went for a more like chaotic good character, you know, that doesn't it's more of a giant monster in that film than a character. And so for Gamera versus Gyaos, you know, this time around they really they got rid of the horror elements that Gamera the Giant Monster had. They got rid of the lack of character in Gamera versus Barugon, and they created more of a character for Gamera, and I think the suit definitely uh, is a good outline for that because it does look different. It looks nicer. It looks a little less terrifying. This is a Gamera I could see falling in line with what Noriaki Yuasa once said, which I'm going to butcher this quote, but it basically was, and I'm trying to quote here: "When I was a kid, I didn't have anybody. So when I went to create Gamera, I wanted a character that kids could say, 'Oh, I'm not alone. I have Gamera on my side.'" End quote. That's kind of a rough quoting of what Noriaki Yuasa said in an interview, but he wanted Gamera to be that character for children that they could say, "Oh, Gamera's on my side. I'm not alone," because growing up and during the war and right after the war for Noriaki Iwasa, he didn't really have that. He saw adults being very conflicted, and he didn't want the next generation of children to be stuck with watching conflicted adults try to adapt and move on with life. So you see that especially in these, starting with Gauss, and how Gamera is portrayed as a more heroic, like definite, like this is Gamera kind of esque character traits to really be nice towards child audience members.
Yeah, I mean, Gamma is more of a children friendly kaiju monster. I mean, not like even after Gamera. I mean, a few years. I mean, I know that he did the what you said that he did make Gamera into a friendly children to make children like feel like they want Gamera to be real. The children thought Gamera was like a real giant turtle in the real world, but somehow they some kids use their imagination and feel like they like when you said kids like don't have any friends that they made, but they say that as long as they have Gamera with them in their imagination, I mean that's my thought. I mean, it's like years later. I mean, I know they made a character who is children friendly, and as Barney the purple dinosaur. I mean that. I mean, Barney was released years. I mean, like between, I think 10 or 20 years after Gamera.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I mean, there's also kind of dinosaur or creature characters who are children friendly. I mean, which I explained that Barney is like the friend of all children because he's a dinosaur, and 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 I also love that one scene in the film where Gamma gives the kid Itchy like the give him a ride on Gamera's back
Mhm.
after he defeat Gauss, and I looked away when Gamma landed. He's a land right next to an amusement park. I mean, and it's almost like Gamma's taking the Itchy to a carnival and go on rides and
Yeah, so what's interesting about that is that's actually a the setting for the construction workers. That's their home base for building this highway. And so Gamera flew to this area knowing that they could help him, which is very interesting because the whole thing in the film is there's a group of highway construction workers trying to build a highway through this village, and they're trying to get the villagers to sell them their land. And at the same time, the Sendai airport in real life was trying to be built, and the villagers of that area were not budging, and there was a lot of protests going on. Rex does a beautiful job at talking about it in our episode on Gauss, but the film kind of covers the whole concept of urbanization as a good thing, and Gamera supports it by going to these construction workers and having them save the child character in this film, and instead of like the villagers or somebody, because they're painting those construction workers in a positive light, which is interesting.
Yeah, and the villagers were kind of not happy about this because this is their home and they have nowhere else to go.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, in the film, they paint the villagers as kind of the villains. Like they paint them as like greedy, and like they don't like that's they're only in it for the money, which is interesting. And it's very different from what you might see in a film produced by Toho at the time that kind of frowned upon the concept of urbanization. At least that's what the filmmakers did. I think of Yoshimitsu Banno's Godzilla versus Hedorah, or Ishiro Honda's All Monsters Attack, that kind of frown upon urbanization and industrialization, which is very different from this film.
Yeah, and I also don't like this reporter who was like hiking and then in that mountain when he spotted Itchy, and then I like the way when they discovered the cave. I mean, I'm not sure. I was like, I don't know if that kid should trust that guy. I mean, they go into the cave and there was a little earthquake, and the reporter just leaves Itchy behind. I mean, when Itchy's called for help, and he just dished the kid and trying to escape, and then Giles just shows up, picks him up. I mean, and ace him. I mean, that's like one of my favorite moment in the film is
Yeah, that's Noriaki Yuasa very, very much likes to paint adults as kind of neglectful, which makes sense when you realize how he grew up, especially with a parent that was a popular actor who was not around a lot of times. And you definitely see throughout the film the very huge disdain Noriaki Yuasa has for adults. And he quite frequently gives the younger characters, Eiichi and his sister, a lot of the time to shine and to solve issues. In fact, at the very end, whenever the village leader has his redemption arc of sorts, he credits his redemption to Eiichi and his ideas for how to get rid of GYAOS.
yeah, and I mean they did study Giles. I mean we all learned that Giles is like his main weakness is sunlight, and kind of like with Baragon, his weakness is water, and yeah, but Giles is sunlight. So, and we just saw that there is a red light on top of his head. We all and then scientists learned that Giles like drinks blood. I mean, I remember that scene that they build a trap for him and they make him drink the blood and makes him dizzy, but it failed. And
Yeah, that was all because so Noriaki Yuasa, as I've established, is a fan of horror, and at the time there was hype around the upcoming Toho film King Kong no Gyakushu, or as we know it, King Kong Escapes. And so Noriaki Yuasa once said in an interview that Toho had done two of the world's most popular monsters, King Kong, a la King Kong versus Godzilla, King Kong Escapes, and Frankenstein, a la Frankenstein versus Barugon and the War of the Gargantuas.
yeah, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but I gotta say they were gonna have have Frankenstein. I mean, Toho did have to manage to have Frankenstein to be in King Kong versus Godzilla, but but Frankenstein was replaced with Godzilla, so the
Right.
title was going to be King Kong versus Frankenstein. But they switched him to Godzilla, and then but they didn't have any. But they didn't have Frankenstein until 1965 for Frankenstein Conquers the World or versus Baragon.
Right. Yeah, and so for GAMERA versus GYAOS, they Noriaki Yuasa ended up he said that he wanted to adapt the third most popular monster in the world, which was Dracula.
Dracula.
Yes, which is really cool because the whole concept of eating blood, the idea of only being out at night, the whole nocturnal thing. Gyaos is very much a bat-looking monster.
Yeah, or vampire. Just
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting because the concept of Western monsters in Eastern films, especially Dracula at the time. Prior to this, there had only been two films by Nobuo Nakagawa, who made The Vampire Moth in 1956 and Dracula's or The Vampire Girl, I believe it is, which was another film that Nobuo Nakagawa did in 1959 that actually had uh, a vampire in it, more akin to Dracula. And after this, Gyaos would be really the next monster to pull from the Dracula mythos. And that's very interesting. And eventually Toho would go on to do their own Dracula trilogy in the early 70s, known as the Bloodthirsty trilogy
yeah,
and whatnot.
and when they're gonna make this film, I mean, they come up with so many titles for this. They were gonna have Gamma versus Dracula, but next they saw decide to have Gamma versus Vampire,
Mhm.
but they kind of they said it sounds ridiculous. I mean, they thought it was cool to have Dracula's name to refer to as Vampira. I mean, or vampire.
Yeah,
Or
so in the Japanese language, it would be vampire. So
vampire.
because they don't have a v sound in their vocabulary, so v becomes b, so it'd be vampire. Uh,
Va- yeah, vampire.
yeah, so it would become kamira tai vampire. Um, but yeah, like you said, they ended up, as Nihon Takahashi continued to revise that script over the few months he did, it ended up turning into GYAOS,
Yeah,
which
I mean, a movie of Gamma versus Dracula, that would be a ridiculous film to watch. I mean, Gamma versus Dracula. I mean, Dracula is only our size. I mean, can you imagine if have like a 50-foot tall Bela Lugosi, who is the original Dracula, who would fight a giant turtle?
well, it's interesting you bring that up because there is actually a couple of monsters that are Dracula inspired. In Return of Ultraman, there was Draculus, which was a kaiju that appeared in episode 36. And then in Ultraman Tiga, there was a Chiranus, which was a vampire bat monster. So there actually, since Gyaos, have been other concepts of Dracula vampiric monsters in the kaiju egosphere, mostly in the Ultraman franchise, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are other types of vampires who are like, they are like more like than Dracula's, not ones in capes, but it's just like giant mutated vampire monsters, kind of like some of the ones in the movie Van Helsing. That's the one from 2004, I think.
I believe so, yes. I know more about Eastern vampire movies than I do Western. I just saw the original Dracula for the first time back in May. So I'm
Really,
very behind.
really, the Bela Lugosi film.
Yep,
That
and
was that was a few months ago.
I watched it for the first time a few months ago, and then I also watched the Spanish version the same night.
Wow.
Shout out to Danny DeManna of the Godzilla novelization project for recommending me that amazing movie and showing it to me.
It
Uh,
is it is amazing film, the original Bela Lugosi film, and yeah, I should definitely do a podcast episode of all the classic Universal monsters.
yeah, and what's speaking of those Universal monsters, there's a lot of cool callbacks to those characters. Another vampire film from Japan that came out in 1968. It was by Shochiku. It was called Gokei Body Snatcher in Hell, which actually had a Dracula character from space come down, and it would take the form of humans and it would drink their blood. And it's a very cool art housey film that I would recommend anybody to watch.
Wow.
And you would also see this is another Dai callback. I believe Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, and the Wolfman all make appearances in Takashi Miike's The Great Yokai War Guardians that came out in 2022 that SRS Cinema recently put out. That also has Daimajin in it as a Great Bujin. So it's not technically Daimajin, but it's the character that transforms into Daimajin.
Wow. Very interesting. But, and wow, it's been 50 minutes already? I mean, I guess, yes. Wow, I guess we could go, keep going this for another 10 minutes or so. I mean, yeah, because I don't have that much more information about this film that I know so far. I mean, yeah, Giles is a giant vampire monster. I mean, yeah, I just love the fact, the special effects of the glows on the back of his head and the top of his head. I mean, the both sides of his head are like has a bluish glow on it, and I don't know what that is. I mean, I don't remember. I mean, all I know is the top of his head glows red whatever time sunrise appeared.
Yeah, it's kind of like a time when he's like in danger almost. The way I look at it is kind of like how Dracula starts to like burn when sunlight hits him. GYAOS glows instead. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, and also, I like about he also sprays some sort of yellow powder.
Yes, nipple gas. Yes.
Yes, yeah, I gotta say, this is like, and that I think that you'll use it like to put out Gamera's flying flames when he is flying, or is that just makes him sleepy a little?
It puts out any fire. GYAOS does not like fire, which interestingly enough, the way I kind of view it is GYAOS. So Dracula doesn't like garlic. Originally, GYAOS was going to be uh his weakness was going to be to a special type of moss that the self-defense force would use against GYAOS, kind of like how garlic works against Dracula. But they later retconned, or not retconned, reconstructed that into what eventually would become fire. And so fire is GYAOS's ultimate uh, uh,
Weakness?
weakness. Yes, thank you. Which is interesting because you have Barugon, which is a land monster who is its weakness is water, and then you have GYAOS, which is a air monster whose weakness is fire. I love that opposing uh, weakness for the Gamera Kaiju. And even at the very end of the film, you get to see a very fun callback as Gamera drags GYAOS into the volcano, just
Yeah,
as Gamera drug Barugon into the river. I love that.
it's like the second time they have Gamera drag a monster into their depths,
Mm-hmm.
and and I and I like the way he pulls Giles into way in the volcano, and they show his beam. And it shows that the monster is dead, and and I noticed if you look carefully when Gamma's dragging Gauss up to the volcano, I mean they usually use props. I mean, if you look carefully on the bottom, I think you can see something that was actually made these props move up.
Really?
I don't know if it's like a little wheels stroller thing that's underneath them, but I'm not sure. But if you look carefully on the bottom of those props,
You've officially piqued my interest. I don't remember seeing that. I'm gonna look real quick because now I wanna see this. So I'm pulling it up real quick if my internet can function with this.
Like, yeah, so there's like, hey, it's yeah, there was like a little like a little stroller. It was underneath the prop, so it was when Gamera's dragging Gauss into the volcano, and then that's as far as I know. When I watched the film like 2 nights ago.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up as we speak because I don't know. I don't remember that. That would be a very cool little thing you have found there that I missed. Okay.
Yeah, and and also known that, you know, if you watch the dubs, I mean, so far that AIP has so far they dubbed 2 films that get in Gamma versus Barugan and Gauss. They actually they just call Gamma Gamera
Yes,
in
yes,
two
they
films
do.
so far. But in the rest of the AIP films, they call him Gamera.
So I'm looking here. I don't see the little device you're talking about.
But
What
but I'm not sure. But I don't know if you look carefully at the bottom. I mean, I just. But I'm not sure. Maybe I did saw something.
huh. Yeah, I don't see it here, but I'd be really interested to um whenever after the stream or something, definitely send me a screenshot of that or something. I'd love to see that. I love seeing little imperfections like that. That's what makes these films beautiful.
Yeah, and that and I also like. I also love the water scene when the kids have this vision is telling Gamera to get well. I mean, they show the cut of his arm. It was when he was underwater, and it kind of bleeds out, and it makes it he lets Gamera lets all of his blood come out, and in the when he was underwater. I mean, couldn't that be affected him? I mean, he's just
The water with the blood?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I think the implication is that Gamera regenerates with water, like the water helps heal Gamera, perhaps because if I remember correctly, in Japanese mythos, turtles are very commonly connected to water. And so the idea of water, healing water, is something that I know in Japanese culture that is a thing, healing water. And so Gamera going to plunge into water to regenerate probably is from that itself.
yeah. And that's that's like how I know. I mean, this after Giles like almost cut off his arm. I mean, but I did notice. I mean, later in the film, Gamera and Giles are even now because at during in the second battle, and Gamera was trying to drag Giles into the water, but he keeps flying away. I mean, and then when the sunrise appears, I mean he's trying to escape really quickly, and he's laser being at Gamera's face. I mean, and then it cut off his own toe.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, so that makes Gamera and Giles even.
Yeah. There's some pretty intense monster gore in this film.
Yeah, and then and we also learn about Giles that it can regenerate its little toe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can. I mean, when it grow into another toe, it doesn't look like any toe at all. It doesn't have like a toenails, a claw, or whatever you want to call it. It just looks like I don't know what I don't know how to describe that toe. It's just looks so weird when he regenerated.
Yeah, it's definitely not 100% developed yet. I think it's still growing at the time of what we see in the film.
Yeah, so well, it kind of looks like we're just about that time. I mean, is there you have any more thoughts about this film, or what do you want to say?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely one of my it's out of the first 3 Gamera films, which are the only ones I've watched in recent times. It's definitely my favorite. Um yeah, there's a lot to kind of dive into this film that's pretty interesting and heavy. Um Anybody who's watching this, like I said, we Kaiju Conversation, we also did this today, Gamera versus GYAOS episode 99. If you want to, after you finish listening to this, I'd say hop on over and give that a listen. There's a lot of good information in there about the Japanese film industry of the time, Dai, and the development of Gamera versus GYAOS. Uh, yeah, this is a really fun movie. I enjoy it. I enjoyed it more than Barugan, and I enjoyed it way more than Gamera the Giant Monster. And Brendan, I appreciate you having me on this episode to talk about it. It was
Yeah,
pretty fun.
and I'm so glad I have you back on my show. And then it's been a while since I had you, and I'm so glad I ran into you at G Fest this year and got to hang out a little with Nathan and the others.
It was a lot of fun. Yeah, we had a good dinner. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it was a good panel that I did that I talked about the return of Godzilla. And and so what I want to say something about this film, I mean, I know it's not one of my favorite. I mean, it was I still watch it but Baragon is still one of my favorite Gamma films and and also I and and it is one of the best Shona era films in the Gamma series and because Giles is a super cool kaiju monster character in the Gamera series. They brought him back in sequels and reboots and and one thing I noticed, I think this is also the first Gamera film that ever had a song that was performed by kids.
Yes, this is the first instance of the Gamera March. They would later, right after this, they would redo the march and make the iconic one that goes "Kamada,
Yeah,
Kamada," you know,
yeah, the
and
classic.
yeah, the one that MST3K did. Gamera is really neat. Gamera is filled with turtle meat. We love eating Gamera. Yeah, that one. And I don't think this one's nearly as iconic, but it is the beginning of that. And what's really cool is we get that theme song played over stock footage from Gamera versus Barugan. In very much a fashion that like this is a television show, it's like a yearly television episode for kids to go watch in theaters, because at the time that's what this was every year kids would go to theaters to watch a Gamera movie. And especially with this one being released as the Japanese school went into spring break for the year, it makes sense that they would want kids to enjoy it, and then they would remember the last Gamera, the last few shots and footage in Gamera was Gamera versus GYAOS was stock footage with a new Gamera theme sung by children, something I think that they would remember going into Gamera versus Viras, which really dived deeper into the whole concept of this is a children's fantasy movie more so than a science fiction monster movie.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I, I mean that song in that film. I mean, wasn't my favorite, but I prefer as the actual Gamma theme, like yeah, what you just mentioned. I mean, yeah, but I like the Mystery Science Theater's theme version more than the original. Like Gamma is filled with me.
Yeah, yeah.
the the lyrics always makes me laugh and all that. Well, Elisha, I mean, thanks for joining me in this episode, and it has been a while since I did a podcast episode, and and hope if all you watching this, and thank you all for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more podcast episodes coming soon. And like I said in Japanese, sayonara.
Bye, guys.